Hi everyone, welcome to the second installation of Research Methods. Before we begin, I just wanted to remind you that there is a quiz up on Blackboard that will cover the first two slide presentations. It's 10 questions. Each question is 2 points each. And I also have another announcement about the assignment and the discussion that is up on the board. I think it's great to have these discussions weekly because some of these topics that I'm bringing up are very current and very relevant, especially not only to research but also to industry. So let's start talking about types of research. We kind of started with that a little bit in the first presentation, but I'd like to expand upon that and talk a little bit more about the spectrum of research. There's a lot of different kinds of research. Some of the things that we've talked about are explanatory research, exploratory research, descriptive research. But there's also, when we're starting to set up research designs, there are types of research that we want to focus on. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about and some of the things that I'm going to elaborate on as we go through this presentation. So the research spectrum, taking a look at these two arrows, and also I apologize for the word pure being upside down, but I could swear that when I first did this about not 9 years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, that word pure was definitely right side up. Something happened in the presentation, but no matter, it still kind of points out that there are two ends of the spectrum. Okay, so the first one is pure, and that's to your left. That's pure research, which is really kind of what we think of as very, very academic research. We think of pure research as things like stem cell research, DNA research, also known a little bit as bench research. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have research that is called applied. And it's exactly what it sounds like. This is basically taking the information that you get from the bench research and applying it, whether it be applying it to animals, applying it to human beings, applying it to exercise and performance, applying it to chronic disease. It is taking that information that you get from one side of the spectrum and then kind of working it into or integrating it into the other side. So these two ends of the spectrum are distinct for sure, but they're also related. And they kind of work together. Now, you could just do pure research, that's absolutely a possibility, and never apply it. Or you could just do applied research and really never kind of get to the pure side. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how we define these two ends of the spectrum and then what other kinds of research are part of these kind of specific types of research, what kind of designs are part of these specific types of research, and how does this hierarchy work? So let's first take a look at pure research. Again, also known as bench research, this explores a particular concept or issue, but with no regard to a specific problem. So if we are trying to find a particular protein, or we discover a particular DNA strand that may cause a genetic mutation, it's not really solving a particular problem, but you are definitely expanding upon the knowledge base of that issue or that concept. And that is what we call pure research or bench research. It's done to, number one, gain an understanding about an issue or concept. It's also done where there is no immediate value. So in other words, if you do find a protein, let's say, that is responsible for muscular dystrophy, you then have to apply that information to individuals with muscular dystrophy, or you need to at least look at slices of muscle and this protein to see whether or not the muscle develops the characteristics of muscular dystrophy. But you can't necessarily do anything with the findings that you have from your pure or bench research. Even though that can lead to a solution, the pure bench research doesn't necessarily have an inherent solution or value. It contributes to intellectual inquiry. So again, dealing with chronic disease, could be diabetes or obesity, finding a gene or finding a protein that links to levels of obesity in a particular population could be amazing in terms of the intellectual inquiry, the questions that intellects will have or academics may have after you present your findings. So there's a major contribution there, and there's a definite necessity for this kinds of research. But again, it doesn't necessarily have value in and of itself. And very, very common in academics. Not only that, but common in medical centers. There are a lot of people who spend hours and hours in labs every day to just isolate particular proteins or to isolate specific genes. These are the people that begin the research that then becomes applied later on. So let's move on to applied research. This is called, in kind of medical centers or academic medical centers, this is called bed-related research. So we go from the bench to the bed. Applied research solves a specific problem and provides a solution. So now we take the information that we learned from the bench research, we then apply it to a human being or to a living physiology, and then we see how it interacts with that physiology. Those findings then give us a solution, either what we found in the bench research and then applied to human or a animal physiology just didn't work, or it did, and oh my God, now we have a solution to a major problem. So again, it's important to understand that these two ends of the spectrum work in concert together. So what does this do? Well, this begins to answer a practical question. This is where as I was talking about in the first presentation, practical applications become important. Because from the bench research, you don't really have the practical applications until you then take that information and integrate it into something that is kind of a physiological being or a living physiology that you can then measure, get objective information on. Then you can say, hey, okay, this works or it doesn't work. Intervening to show efficacy. In other words, we use an intervention, a type of, if we put it in exercise physiology terms, in many of the studies that are done, the intervention is a training program. The intervention is a specific type of exercise. The intervention is a situation where, an individual gets a certain kind of food or they're fed a certain diet or whatever. So we look to see whether that intervention is effective. Is it efficacious? Does it show efficacy? So when we apply all the information that we learned from the bench, we can then see whether or not it's effective. It's valuable to any industry. Those can be industries related to exercise or industries not related to exercise. Applied research can be done anywhere, but the findings from that research can be very, very valuable to the decision makers of a particular industry. And also it demonstrates changes and demonstrates the importance and the significance of using a particular type of intervention, a particular kind of exercise program, a particular kind of diet. Let's take, for instance, the Atkins diet, which was big in the 1980s, a diet that primarily kind of prided itself on very high levels of protein. And what was found with the Atkins diet was there was a tremendous amount of success in the first year in terms of weight loss because, number one, individuals were eating a lot of protein. They weren't eating a lot of kind of water-laden carbohydrate. They were probably eating less calories in total because the protein was satiating their hunger. And you started to see that a lot of people lost weight, whether or not cholesterol levels and heart attacks rose or whatever. That's besides the point. The weight loss was what was shown to be extremely significant and important, at least in the first year. If you looked over the course of 2 to 3 years after someone's on Atkins, usually they gain the weight back. But it demonstrated that this type of diet could really have a major impact on weight loss. And that's just one example, but there are a lot of other examples of how applied research can really impact a population or even, the public as a whole. Let's move on to kind of another level of this research, and this can be really this is more in the applied section of the spectrum. It's primary research, and it's known as prospective, meaning you're kind of looking forward. Think of prospective as looking forward, collecting data as you go. It's defined as the collection of original or specific data related to a particular project. And you'll kind of see how I'm going to distinguish this distinguish this from its counterpart in a moment. This helps to move an idea forward. And again, this can be research on anything in any industry, but prospective data is actual data collection. You're actually collecting the data as you go. The second thing that it's related to is intervention. So for instance, we were going to do a study, although it never got off the ground, and it was going to be one of my favorite studies to do, but we were going to do a study at LIU looking at the effect of a supplement called NO-Explode, made by BSN and sold in GNC. I'm sure you've seen it. If you haven't seen it, it comes in like a red canister. It's a pink kind of powder, or at least it was when they first started it. And it was said to be kind of the new workout supplement. And its claim to fame was that it used nitric oxide, actually L-arginine, which is a precursor to nitric oxide, which is a naturally found substance in our endothelial cells, which kind of line the blood vessels. And as we exercise, the blood actually, because we're pumping blood through our system so quickly when we exercise, the rush of blood tears off the lining of the endothelial cells, and what's released is something called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide basically helps to dilate or widen the blood vessels, allowing for a greater amount of oxygenation and more blood to flow to muscles and so on and so forth. And to give you a real good visual, Viagra is what nitric oxide is based on. So Furchtgott, who discovered nitric oxide in a compound called sildenafil, actually created what is known as Viagra. It wasn't Viagra at the time, and obviously his point wasn't erectile dysfunction, but the fact is that pharmaceutical companies figured, hey, this is great, we have a gold mine, and of course they do. But anyway, that kind of study, looking at the effect of nitric oxide on physiology, was what we were going to do. So we had an intervention that was 10 weeks long. It was a strength training intervention, and we were basically going to have one group take the NO-Explode, one group take Kool-Aid that was going to be colored like the NO-Explode, and also it would taste like the NO-Explode, and then have another group just do the strength training without anything. And we wanted to see, number one, increases in strength, but we also had ways of measuring the levels of nitric oxide. So we were trying to move the idea forward. We were trying to say, well, either this supplement is effective or it's not effective. Now, I will guarantee, if you look for clinical data on NO-Explode, chances are you're not going to find much on levels of nitric oxide specifically and its relationship to strength training. But anecdotally, people seem to like it, and they seem to have a greater stamina when they exercise. So sales have been somewhat through the roof, and they've also built off, they've spun off several products related to NO-Explode at this point. Also, prospective studies can be related to questionnaires or surveys, and questionnaires about anything. I remember that I had a colleague at LIU in the public health department who was looking at I believe it was looking at African Americans with HIV, and his entire thesis was based on a questionnaire. So doing a questionnaire doesn't mean the research is any worse or it's, kind of inferior. It just means that it's a different way of designing the study, a different way of collecting the data. And, for many individuals, for many researchers, questionnaires can be extremely effective. So using a questionnaire or survey can definitely be considered a kind of data collection intervention that is prospective. Let's take a look at the other side of this, though. The other side, known as secondary research, again, under the applied umbrella, and can also be a little bit under the pure umbrella, is retrospective research. And retro just means looking back. So we have prospective looking forward, we have retrospective looking back. Retrospective research is defined as original data that is not collected, but the project uses existing archival information to inform the question. So let's take a look at what that really means. So let's say, for instance, you want to study levels of cancer in a certain population in a particular geographical area. Okay? It would be very difficult to do that if you were doing it prospectively, because chances are you might have to start at a younger age in the population and then look 20, 25 years down the road to see whether or not there was an increase in cancer. Now, however, you could look at medical data retrospectively and determine levels of cancer in a particular population in a geographical area by just looking at the data that exists. So chances are you would have a much easier time looking at it retrospectively than looking at it prospectively. Now, you still do data collection, you do data analysis, you publish your findings, you do all of that. It's just a different way of collecting the data. So where is retrospective research kind of found? Well, one thing is it may be mentioned in a literature review. So if you are, let's say, publishing a paper or you're writing up a research article, you're doing a lit review, which is basically a review of all the literature around the issue that it is, that you're studying. And in that literature review, there may be work that was done retrospectively. Again, it is not necessarily inferior. You can't belittle authors for doing it that way. It's just a different way of collecting the data. However, similarly to the prospective study, this moves the data forward. It just uses a different method of data collection using existing data as opposed to collecting data as you go forward. So what are some studies that use retrospective data? Database related studies, so again, having a database on people with cancer in a particular geographic location, or census studies, right? You can't, it's very, very difficult to get that data prospectively as you're moving forward. So it's great to actually look at it retrospectively and then determine what was said kind of in the past could maybe inform what's going to happen in the future. So, there is definitely a big need for retrospective analysis. Not as easy as it sounds because databases are very large. You would have to, if you were narrowing a question down, you would have to look through a lot of data to get a narrow focus, but definitely a way to do research. So under the pure side of the spectrum, let's take a look at the theoretical way of doing research. And this is using findings from other work to develop ideas and postulates. So let's kind of let's qualify this for a second. As I said in the first presentation, there's been a lot of research out there, right? We're talking hundreds of thousands and millions of articles that have been out there on every single issue under the sun, basically. So why then does your research, why does it warrant publication? Why is it something that could add to the literature? Well, you could look at something theoretical and say, okay, there are findings here that I understand in my particular issue or concept. There are findings that I concur with, but there are also findings here that I disagree with, and I'm going to do something a little bit different than what has been done before. I'm going to develop some new ideas based on what was done in the past. That happens all the time. Now, it's not that physiology changes or anatomy changes, because it really doesn't. But the way we look at it and the design we use to research it is what changes. So the methodology could be completely different. And if you think about it, what's one way of doing it? Well, you may have a new idea that wasn't tested, that wasn't examined. There wasn't an experiment using your method or your idea. That's a great way of taking a theoretical concept and spinning it off into a new study or into new research. Ideas can be described too. You don't necessarily have to do an interventional kind of study where it's tested, but you could describe new ideas. You could maybe have kind of a new postulate, a new theory. And again, most of the time in science, we find these things. Like in sciences like astronomy, astrophysics. These are areas where new postulates come up all the time. So it's a new way of thinking about an old idea. And it may warrant further inquiry. So again, your new idea may cause a scientist across the globe to say, wow, that's a really interesting theory. Maybe we need to inquire into this. Maybe we do need to do something that is considered either applied or something that's considered empirical. And that's where we're moving into the development of new ideas through data collection. So again, theoretical is just the theory, right? It's just coming up with a postulate or a new idea, and it could be based on what's been done before. But empirical research is the development of new ideas through the actual collection of data. And this is using measurement, using observation, and getting objective information on a particular topic or issue. Empirical data moves ideas forward to be investigated with new methods. So moving ideas forward, and again, this could be a prospective study, but doing it where there are new methods in play, that another scientist would look at this and say, that's very interesting. I didn't think of it that way. Here's a new method to look at something that's been done before. And like I said before, a lot of research has been done in the past. So in order to have something that's novel, in order to have something that's unique, it's usually something that is based on something that's been done before, but has a different spin, a different tact, and a different method. So putting it all together, let's take a look at the hierarchy of how this works. We have types of research that are on a spectrum. And maybe you can see this mouse, and maybe you can't. You might not be able to, but I'm pointing at the pure side of things. So the pure side is defined as the bench research. It's defined as the research that we do to find information, but for no specific purpose or specific reason, or we're not posing any kind of solution. On the other side of the spectrum, we have applied research, which is much more specific, and it's taking the information we learned from the pure research and applying it to an industry, an intervention, a physiology, something where we can see the effectiveness of what we find in the pure research side of things. And if we break down the pure research side, we have the primary and the secondary version of that. Primary being information that we take and we move forward with that information. We prospectively look at it, whereas secondary is we really take a retrospective look at what that data might say. Again, that could be considered kind of bench research, even though that's a little bit fuzzy. You still have that ability to have that secondary side of things. In the applied research, you're primarily, I hate to say this, but it's primarily primary, which sounds ridiculous, but mostly it's primary because what you're trying to do in applied research is you're trying to kind of integrate an intervention and then see how whatever it is that you're studying is affected by that intervention. Or you're trying to see how a particular population kind of responds to either an intervention or to the variable that you're trying to study. So primary research, that prospective side of things, is really important in the applied portion of the spectrum. However, secondary research, there's a question mark. It's somewhat difficult to do a retrospective analysis when you're looking at applied research, because applied research is defined by actually applying what it is that you learned to, like I said, a population, a physiology, a situation. Doing that in a secondary way retrospectively is quite difficult. So I would put a question mark there, and I wouldn't necessarily say that secondary research in the applied side of the spectrum is something that we should actually be doing. If we break down the pure side just a little bit more, then under the secondary side of things, we have theoretical research. Again, this is coming up with a postulate, coming up with an idea that might be based on ideas that have been kind of done before, ideas that have been posited in the past. And then if we look at the applied side of the spectrum, under primary research, we have empirical research. And that's the research that really helps us move forward with new ideas. Again, could be based on ideas that were done in the past, but empirical. These findings are findings from a new method, a new way of doing things. And again, that can stimulate more inquiry. So there's a lot of different kinds of research on this spectrum. What I'd like you to know is the two major sides, the pure and the applied, how to define them, and then what's the difference between primary or prospective research and retrospective research, and what would be some examples of each. And then under the secondary and the primary, what's the difference between theoretical and empirical research, and also examples of those as well. So finishing up just for a moment, taking a look at misconceptions about research. The first one is that it is not research if it involves reading and writing an essay. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think you can definitely research ideas, topics, concepts, and write an essay. And when you're reading an essay, if it's an essay on the particular issue that you're looking to research, that is for sure research. Remember, research is the investigation. It is the question to find an answer. So if you're looking for an answer in what it is that you're reading, then you're definitely doing research. Collection of new data is absolutely research. Again, that really focuses more or is aligned with what I was talking about before, which is primary research, prospective research, or the collection of empirical data. Opinion. Well, I think this is an interesting one. It is not research if it involves opinion. Okay, let's take this for instance, okay? So you tell me something about an exercise physiology text, and I say to you, that's a horrible text because it doesn't really, I mean, the chapters don't flow. It's kind of really, it's very vague. It doesn't have like a focus on research. It's not. Now, you tell another professor, I don't really like this text, and the professor says that's one of the best texts written. Actually, it's quite comprehensive. It has excellent chapters. It has great content. Look at the references it uses. So again, is my opinion really based on research? Well, if I hadn't read the text and it's just off the top of my head, maybe I read a couple of chapters and I don't really like it. Maybe I don't like the author. I don't like the publisher. I'm not really fond of, the way it's done and whatever. That's not really research. However, if you go back and you say, that article, that particular journal article was excellent. I mean, if you look at the introduction and the way it flowed into the methods and their discussion is so comprehensive, it's fantastic. I mean, look at the people who they cited and look at the design. The design is so complex and it all worked. That's not necessarily opinion as much as that's based on the data that I just read. It's also based on having some knowledge of what a journal article should include. That's not necessarily opinion. Is that considered research? It's not considered research, but I think it is related to research. So I wouldn't qualify it as saying it is research in its kind of pure sense, but I would say that it involves research because I had to read the journal article, and if I'm reading the journal article, I'm kind of researching the topic or concept, and then I come up with an opinion based on that. So there's a little bit, there's some different ways of looking at it. One is, if it's off the top of your head, it's probably not research. But if it's based on something you've read thoroughly and you understand and have knowledge of, then it can be related to research. Originality. It's not research if it involves originality. Well, I think some of the greatest research is the most original research. Again, if it is unique and original and novel and can move science forward in any industry, then I definitely consider it to be research. Last one is solutions to a problem. Again, not all research is done to find a solution to a problem, but some is. And if it's done to find a solution to a problem, that's a fantastic way of applying findings, of applying research findings. So I do believe that solutions to a problem that can be based on research that's been done in the past, whether prospectively or retrospectively, is considered research. So let's look at taming the beast, because there's a lot of information, a lot of different boxes here and lines connecting those boxes in the other slide. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, but I do want you to take a look at this slide and use it as a reference when you read a journal article. Let's take a look at this for a second. Let's break it down. First of all, if you locate articles, I want you to locate articles that are comfortable to you in terms of length and also content and are of a familiar concept. So if at any point in time in the next few weeks or even for your research project, take a look at some articles that are out there in the beginning that are a little bit less complex and that are a little bit more familiar. And even before you do your research project, look at some articles that are of a familiar kind of content. So if you're into baseball, look at some articles on baseball. If you're into dancing, look at some articles on dancing. If you're into martial arts, look at articles on martial arts. If you're into non-physical things, look at articles on non-physical things. I'm telling you, you could find research on anything except knitting. I've never seen a journal article on knitting. There's probably a knitting journal somewhere. The second thing is read the article, but read what is interesting to you and again familiar to you, and try to personalize it as best as you can. So try to make it somewhat personal so that you have a stake in it, so that your interest is piqued more than it is kind of a chore to read it. The first thing you're going to come up against is called the abstract, and this is a summary of the article, usually quite short, has a little bit of an introduction, has a little bit about the methods, a little bit about the results, and then usually a conclusion. And usually they're somewhere between 250 to 300 words. Look at the abstract and get an idea of the taste and flavor of the abstract. Is it too complex? Is it too vague? Is it too simple? Does it seem like it's just right? Is there a lot of statistics and numbers in there, or is it much more verbiage? What does the abstract look like? Kind of familiarize yourself with that. Then try to find the hypothesis or the aims in the article. Usually it comes at the end of the introduction. So try to identify those pieces in the article. Take a look at the methods. Usually the methods section has a highlighted kind of bold methods title, and see how they did this. What kind of equipment did they use? What kind of materials did they use? What was the design of this study? How did they do it? Did they have two groups? Did they have one group? Did they have two groups that did the same thing but crossed over at different times? Were they 18 to 25-year-olds? Were they over 60 years old? Did they use a bike, a treadmill? Did they go outside in a field? Did they use a lab? Did they not use a lab? Did they use specific equipment? Really start to ask yourself those questions and break down the article. The key question to understanding research, or I should say the key question when you read a journal article, is so what, meaning big deal, what does this mean? If you can't answer the so what after reading the article, then they haven't done their job as authors trying to convey to you what it is that they did and the significance of what they did. So if you come away with a so what that's like, wow, this is really going to impact either the population they studied, or it's going to impact the public on a greater scale, or wow, this is really significant, that's great. But if you come up with a so what that's completely empty, then there's a problem with the research article. So please ask yourself that question, so what? And what is it, how is it relevant to the question that they asked, to their hypothesis? And how does it relate to further work down the line? One of the things that you're going to do in your research project, although it's kind of like it's a research project that's a little bit kind of fictionalized, right? It's fiction because I'm not asking you to actually go and collect data, but I would like you to look at the research that's been done in the past in the areas that I gave you, and tell me what other further work needs to be done. Where are the gaps in the literature? What other kind of research needs to be carried out in order to either round out the the knowledge base, or to just further it, to add to it? That's a real important question. What are the numbers here? How many subjects did they test? What did they find? You don't have to overanalyze it, and I'm not looking for you to do statistics on the research that you're, on the articles that you're reading, but just find out, like, did they look at 10 people? Did they look at 150 people? And did they find that, there were findings that were significant, or was nothing significant? Try to answer those questions as well. And then the last thing is, what are the strengths of the article? What are the weaknesses of the article? And how objective do you think the authors were? Was there any bias? Do you think that they, because they got paid, let's say, to do it, or got a grant to do it, is there a bias? When they were looking at the data, did they do the data collection and data analysis, or did somebody else do that? And that will kind of lend itself to objectivity. And it's very important when you do research that you are objective, that you're looking at it from the outside. So what I'd like you to do is, for the particular assignment that I gave you, which is an article on looking at health food products and their effectiveness as far as their placement in a supermarket, is to look at the strengths and weaknesses. That's all I want you to do this week. Look at the strengths and weaknesses, but at least use what's on this slide to determine what those strengths and weaknesses are. Read the article, it's not very long. Read the article and break it down based on what this slide is telling you. And then give me 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses and a short explanation of why you feel that way. So I'm going to end here, and I will always entertain any questions that you might have, both about the slides, about the course, obviously about the technology in Blackboard, because we had a few glitches to begin with. Also, please check the announcements, because I'm putting up announcements. Usually I put them up every week. Again, there is a quiz, which will be due, I believe, next Monday. And that is also on the syllabus. And in addition to that, there is an assignment. And I would also like to set up a Google Hangout either for this weekend or next weekend. Whatever works best for you guys, you need to let me know. I've sent you a doodle poll where you just click and then just sign your name and basically check off what days work best for you. So I wish you a very happy and healthy week. I also wish you a lot less snow, and I will be talking to you soon. Okay, take care.